The surveyor's compass stopped working near the limestone outcrop in March of 1821. Jacob Merritt had been mapping Georgia backcountry for 3 years, but he'd never seen freshly turned earth in such a remote location. When he investigated, he found graves, 3 of them, and behind them, a cave entrance that shouldn't have been disturbed. Jacob Merritt had learned to trust his instincts during his years surveying the wilderness territories of northern Georgia. The morning he discovered the graves, those instincts were screaming. He'd been following property lines through dense forest when his instruments began behaving erratically, the needle of his compass spinning without settling. The limestone formations in this region were known to affect such equipment, but this felt different, more deliberate somehow. The graves were crude but deliberate. Someone had taken considerable effort to dig into the rocky soil, marking each mound with flat stones arranged in careful patterns. No crosses, no names, just stones that looked recently placed, moss-free and still showing tool marks. Merritt counted 3 distinct burial sites, each approximately 6 feet in length. The earth was dark and freshly settled, no more than a few weeks old by his estimation. What drew his attention next was the cave entrance, partially concealed by overgrown vegetation that had been recently disturbed. Branches were snapped, not broken naturally by weather or animals, but deliberately pushed aside. Someone had been using this entrance regularly. Fresh boot prints marked the muddy approach, multiple sizes including what appeared to be children's footwear. Against his better judgment, Merritt lit his lantern and entered. The cave opened into a surprisingly large chamber, the ceiling high enough for a man to stand comfortably. What he found inside contradicted everything he understood about transient travelers or hunters seeking temporary shelter. This had been a dwelling. Crude sleeping pallets made from pine boughs lined one wall, arranged with disturbing precision. A makeshift hearth showed signs of careful fire management, the stones blackened, but arranged to minimize smoke. Clay vessels held preserved food stores, nuts and dried meat, quantities suggesting weeks of habitation. But it was the walls that made Merritt's hands shake as he raised his lantern higher. Scratch marks covered the limestone surface. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Not random or chaotic, but organized into columns and rows, tallies of some kind, tracking something with obsessive regularity. In some places, the marks were so deep they'd worn grooves into the stone, as though whoever made them had returned again and again to the same spots, reinforcing their desperate accounting. Merritt spent 2 hours documenting what he found before the weight of the place drove him back toward sunlight. He emerged convinced of one certainty. Whatever had happened in these caves, whatever had driven people to scratch their existence into solid stone while living in darkness near fresh graves, it wasn't the work of ordinary travelers. This was something else entirely, something that required answers. When he reached the county seat 3 days later, mud-stained and exhausted, the officials listened to his report with polite skepticism. Travelers often used caves for shelter. Graves in remote areas weren't uncommon. The scratches could be anything, they said. Animals, perhaps. Natural erosion patterns. But Merritt knew better. He'd seen the precision of those marks, the deliberation of that underground dwelling. Someone had lived there. Someone had died there. And somewhere in the incomplete records of this frontier county, there had to be a reason why. The clerk at the county office was a meticulous man named Thomas Vaughn, who'd held his position for nearly 2 decades. When Merritt insisted on examining property records for the region surrounding the cave, Vaughn initially resisted. But there was something in the surveyor's demeanor that suggested this wasn't idle curiosity. After considerable persuasion, he unlocked the records room. They found the Patterson homestead listed in the 1819 land grants. Edmund Patterson had claimed 80 acres of farmland in the territory Merritt had been surveying, the property boundaries placing his homestead less than 3 miles from the limestone caves. The deed remained active, taxes unpaid since the previous autumn. Vaughn explained this wasn't unusual. Settlers frequently abandoned claims when the land proved too difficult or when better opportunities beckoned further west. But something about the file troubled Vaughn once he began examining it more closely. The Patterson family had registered with unusual thoroughness. Edmund Patterson, age 34, occupation listed as farmer and carpenter. Ruth Patterson, his wife, age 31, formerly Ruth Ashford of Virginia. 4 children. Margaret, age 12, Jonathan, age 9. The twins, Samuel and Rebecca, age 6. The detail was remarkable for frontier records of that period, suggesting a family that had intended permanence. Merritt asked about the circumstances of their departure. Vaughn retrieved additional documents, his expression growing more concerned as he read. Several neighbors had filed inquiries about the property in late 1820. The Pattersons had simply vanished. Their cabin stood locked, crops unharvested in the fields. Livestock had been discovered wandering, unfed and distressed. One neighbor, a man named Cornelius Drake, had broken into the cabin after 2 weeks of silence, fearing illness or tragedy. What Drake found was more unsettling than an empty home. The cabin was orderly, almost deliberately so. Dishes were washed and stacked. Beds were made with military precision. Clothing hung neatly on pegs, but personal items were missing. The family Bible that Ruth Patterson had shown to neighbors, with pride. Edmund's carpentry tools. All the children's shoes. It appeared they had planned to leave, taking what mattered most, yet abandoning everything that represented their investment in the land. Drake's written statement, filed with the county in October of 1820, noted other peculiarities. The cabin's windows had been covered from the inside with heavy cloth, nailed into the frames. The root cellar was completely empty, though harvest season had just passed, and families typically stored provisions for winter. Most strangely, he'd found a calendar on the cabin wall where someone had marked certain dates with heavy ink, creating a pattern that made no immediate sense. The marks appeared to track moon phases, though why a farming family would need such meticulous lunar tracking remained unclear. Vaughn pulled another document from the file, a letter from Edmund Patterson's brother in Virginia, written in January of 1821, inquiring about the family. The brother, whose name was listed as William Patterson, expressed confusion about why his correspondence had gone unanswered for months. He mentioned that Edmund had written to him the previous summer, describing successful crops and plans to expand the homestead. Nothing in that letter suggested any intention to relocate. The final document in the file was a formal missing persons notation, filed in November of 1820. This was unusual for the period. Families moved without notice frequently, but something about the Patterson disappearance had concerned local authorities enough to create an official record. The notation described the family as departed under circumstances suggesting distress or compulsion. Whereabouts unknown. Investigation suspended due to lack of evidence. Merritt laid out his map on Vaughn's desk, marking the location of the caves in relation to the Patterson homestead. The proximity was undeniable. Vaughn stared at the map, then at the files, his face pale. They both understood what the evidence suggested, even if neither wanted to speak it aloud yet. A family of 6 had vanished. 3 graves had appeared near caves, showing signs of habitation. The mathematics were terrible, but they couldn't be ignored. 2 people remained unaccounted for, and somewhere in the darkness of those limestone chambers, there might be answers to what had driven the Patterson family from their home and into the earth itself. Sheriff Benjamin Cartwright organized a formal expedition to the caves within 3 days of Merritt's report. 6 men entered the limestone system on a cold morning in late March, carrying lanterns and rope, prepared to document whatever secrets the darkness held. What they discovered in those depths would transform a missing family into Georgia's most disturbing mystery. The main chamber Merritt had found was only the beginning. Beyond it, narrow passages led deeper into the earth, winding through limestone corridors that opened into additional rooms. The expedition mapped 7 distinct chambers over the course of 6 hours, each showing evidence of human occupation. But it was the 3rd chamber that stopped them cold. Someone had created living spaces with disturbing intentionality. Sleeping areas were arranged in a specific pattern, the largest pallet positioned nearest the passage entrance, smaller ones arranged behind it in descending size order. A family formation. Each space had been defined by stones placed in careful borders, creating boundaries in the darkness. Within these stone borders, they found fragments that told stories no one wanted to hear. A child's cotton dress, torn and stained beyond cleaning, lay folded in one of the smaller spaces. In another, they discovered a slate board, the kind used for teaching arithmetic. Someone had written simple addition problems on its surface. 3 + 4 = 7. 5 + 2 = 7. The chalk marks were smudged, but still visible, as though small fingers had practiced these lessons by lantern light in complete isolation from the world above. The expedition's documentation grew more detailed as they moved through the chambers. Clay vessels similar to those Merritt had found were scattered throughout, some still containing remnants of food. Dried corn kernels, preserved strips of what appeared to be venison, quantities that suggested careful rationing over an extended period. Someone had been living here, surviving here, for far longer than a few days or weeks. But it was the walls that revealed the true horror of the situation. The scratch marks Merritt had observed in the first chamber were nothing compared to what they found deeper in the system. Entire walls were covered in tallies, the marks organized into groups of 5 in the traditional counting method. Sheriff Cartwright attempted to count them in one chamber, but gave up after reaching 300. The marks continued beyond his counting, perhaps into the thousands. More disturbing were the words, carved into the limestone with what must have been a metal implement. Someone had inscribed fragments of text. The handwriting was deteriorating, growing more erratic the deeper into the cave system they explored. In the 4th chamber, they found a complete sentence carved at shoulder height. "We are safe here in the watching dark." In the 5th chamber, another. "Edmund says the air above is poison now." The 6th chamber contained what appeared to be a crude calendar system. Vertical lines represented days, grouped into sections of 7. Horizontal marks crossed these at intervals, possibly denoting weeks or months. If the system was accurate, someone had been tracking time in these caves for approximately 19 weeks. From September through January, the calendar suggested. Nearly 5 months of living in perpetual darkness. The most haunting discovery came in the deepest chamber they could access. Here, partially obscured by moisture, damage, they found a leather-bound journal wedged into a crevice in the rock. The binding was swollen, many pages destroyed by dampness and mold. But several pages near the center of the book had survived, protected by the compressed layers surrounding them. Sheriff Cartwright carefully extracted the journal and opened it to the surviving pages. The handwriting was feminine, refined despite the difficult conditions under which it must have been written. The ink had bled in places, making some words illegible, but enough remained to make his hands tremble as he read by lantern light. October 12th. Edmund will not hear my pleading anymore. The children cry for sunlight, but he says we must remain. He speaks of watchers in the trees, shadows that move with purpose. I see nothing when I look toward the entrance but darkness and stone. Margaret tried to run 3 days past. He caught her before she reached the opening. Now he watches us all through the night, sleeping only when we sleep. The entry ended there. The remaining text on that page too damaged to decipher. Cartwright turned to another surviving page, dated weeks later. November. I have lost count of days. The twins no longer speak. Samuel stares at the walls, tracing the marks Edmund makes each morning. Rebecca sleeps most hours, waking only to eat what little we have remaining. Jonathan has grown thin. His cough worsens. Margaret helps me when Edmund permits it. She is stronger than I am now. I fear what strength remains in me will not last. The final legible passage was the most chilling. December. Jonathan is silent now. Edmund says we must go deeper. The watching has found our outer chambers. There were no more readable entries. The journal's remaining pages were pulp, destroyed by moisture and time. But what they'd read was enough. Ruth Patterson had documented her family's descent into something far beyond simple refuge. This wasn't shelter from a storm or temporary hiding. This was captivity masked as protection, paranoia transformed into prison. Sheriff Cartwright ordered the journal preserved and carefully wrapped. As the expedition prepared to return to the surface, he took one final look at the chamber walls, at the thousands of desperate tallies carved into stone, at the evidence of 5 months spent in self-imposed exile from the world. Whatever had driven Edmund Patterson to bring his family into these caves, it had consumed them all. News of the cave discovery spread through the county within days, reaching even the isolated settlements at the territory's edges. It was this spreading word that brought Aida forward, though she came reluctantly. Accompanied by her grandson, who served as translator. She was Cherokee, perhaps 70 years old, and she'd been living on treaty land adjacent to the Patterson homestead since before Georgia was properly mapped. Sheriff Cartwright received her in his office on a Thursday morning, the journal still locked in his desk drawer. Through her grandson, Aida explained that she'd avoided coming forward because white authority had rarely shown interest in Cherokee testimony. But the weight of what she'd witnessed had grown too heavy for silence. She'd first noticed the Patterson family's strange behavior in early September of 1820. Edmund Patterson had always been cordial, occasionally trading tools for vegetables from Aida's garden. But that autumn, something changed. She'd seen him near the cave entrance one evening, carrying bundles wrapped in cloth. His movements were furtive, constantly glancing around as though expecting pursuit. When their eyes met across the distance, he'd frozen, then gestured sharply for her to leave. The encounters became more frequent. Aida's land bordered a creek that provided her water, and the path to it passed within sight of the caves. On multiple occasions throughout September and October, she observed the Patterson family making nocturnal journeys, always at night, always carrying supplies. The children moved silently, which disturbed her most. Children were rarely so quiet, so controlled. It suggested fear or extensive conditioning. Her grandson translated carefully as Aida described the night that frightened her most. It was late October, perhaps 3 weeks into their cave dwelling. She'd been returning from the creek near midnight when she heard voices echoing from the cave entrance. Not conversation. Chanting. Edmund Patterson's voice, rhythmic and insistent, speaking words she couldn't distinguish. Behind his voice, she could hear the children responding in unison, their voices hollow in the limestone chamber. She'd moved closer, concerned despite her fear. From a concealed position behind trees, she'd watched the cave entrance. Lantern light flickered deep inside, and she could see shadows moving against the walls. The chanting continued for perhaps 20 minutes before falling silent. Then Margaret, the eldest daughter, appeared at the entrance. The girl stood there, illuminated by moonlight, staring toward the forest with an expression Aida still remembered with absolute clarity. Not fear, not confusion, resignation. The look of someone who'd accepted a terrible fate. Margaret had stood there for several minutes, breathing the night air, before Edmund's voice called from within. The girl's shoulders had slumped, and she'd turned back into the darkness without hesitation. Aida had tried to approach the cave the following week. She'd brought food, thinking perhaps the family needed help. Perhaps Edmund had suffered some breakdown that charity might remedy. But Edmund met her 50 yards from the entrance, appearing suddenly from the trees. His appearance shocked her. He'd lost considerable weight, his clothes hanging loose. His eyes were sunken, but intense, burning with conviction that bordered on fever. He'd spoken to her in a voice that allowed no argument. They were protected here. They were safe. The world above was corrupted, poisoned by forces he wouldn't name. Anyone who interfered would bring those forces down upon his family. He would protect them at any cost. When Aida tried to ask about the children, about whether they needed medicine or food, Edmund had simply shaken his head and walked away, disappearing into the forest. She never approached again, but she continued to hear them. Throughout November and into December, on certain nights when the wind was right, she could hear sounds from the caves. Children's voices, sometimes crying, sometimes singing. Once, she heard Ruth Patterson calling out, the words indistinct, but the tone unmistakable. It was pleading. The sound stopped in January. Complete silence from the caves for weeks. Aida had assumed they'd finally left, perhaps moved deeper into the wilderness, or returned to civilization. She'd felt relief, hoping the family had found their way back to reason. Now, hearing about the graves and the journal, she understood the silence differently. Sheriff Cartwright thanked her formally for her testimony, though his face had grown increasingly grim throughout her account. After Aida and her grandson departed, he sat alone in his office, piecing together the chronology. September, the family enters the caves. October, they're living there permanently, Edmund growing increasingly paranoid. November and December, Ruth's journal documents their deterioration. January, silence falls. March, graves are discovered. Somewhere in that timeline, 3 members of the Patterson family had died. The caves had claimed them, or Edmund's delusions had, or the simple, brutal mathematics of survival in darkness, without adequate food or warmth, had taken their inevitable toll. But 2 people remained unaccounted for, Edmund himself, and one other. The question that haunted Cartwright was simple and terrible. Which members of the family lay in those graves, and where were the survivors now? Dr. Samuel Brennan arrived from Savannah on the 4th of April, 1821, carrying leather cases filled with medical texts and journals documenting cases of mental disturbance. Sheriff Cartwright had written to him specifically because Brennan had published papers on disorders of reasoning and perception, If anyone could make sense of Edmund Patterson's descent into paranoid isolation, it would be him. Brennan spent 2 days examining every piece of evidence. He read Ruth Patterson's surviving journal entries multiple times, studying the handwriting itself for signs of distress. He examined the cave chambers, measuring distances and noting the progressive depth of the family's retreat. He interviewed Aida through her grandson, asking detailed questions about Edmund's behavior and demeanor. Finally, he compiled his analysis in a report that Sheriff Cartwright found both illuminating and deeply unsettling. Edmund Patterson, Brennan concluded, had likely suffered from what medical literature of Yisheng, the period called melancholia, with delusional features. The condition manifested as profound conviction in false beliefs, often centered around threats to oneself or loved ones. Sufferers became increasingly isolated, rejecting contrary evidence and interpreting normal events as confirmation of their fears. In severe cases, they acted on these delusions with complete certainty of purpose. What made Edmund's case particularly tragic was his apparent lucidity in other matters. The cave dwelling showed careful planning and organization. He'd managed to relocate his family with supplies sufficient for extended survival. He'd created systems for tracking time and maintaining order. This wasn't random madness. It was methodical delusion, rational thought, in service of irrational belief. Brennan theorized about possible triggers. Edmund had been a carpenter and farmer, trades requiring precision and control. Perhaps some traumatic event in his past, or even a fever that affected his mind, had planted seeds of paranoia that grew over time. Rural isolation could intensify such conditions. Without regular social contact to challenge distorted thinking, delusions could flourish unchecked. The journal entries suggested Edmund believed in watchers, undefined threats observing his family from the forest. This persecution complex had driven him to seek absolute protection through absolute concealment. The caves offered what his disturbed mind needed: complete separation from the threatening world above, stone walls between his family and the dangers only he could perceive. But Brennan's analysis grew darker when considering the family's fate. The doctor examined the sleeping arrangements documented by the sheriff's expedition. Edmund had positioned himself between his family and the cave entrance, a protective stance, but also a controlling one. He would have regulated all movement, all access to the outside world. The children couldn't leave without passing him first. Ruth's journal confirmed this control. Her references to Edmund not permitting activities, to him catching Margaret when she tried to flee, painted a picture of captivity disguised as protection. The family wasn't sheltering in the caves voluntarily. They were imprisoned there by a man who believed he was saving them. The progression documented in Ruth's entries showed the psychological toll. Children falling silent, the eldest daughter growing resigned, Ruth herself weakening, her hope diminishing with each passing week. They were dying slowly, not from immediate violence, but from the grinding deprivation of life underground. Inadequate food, insufficient warmth, constant darkness, and the psychological weight of confinement. Brennan's most disturbing conclusion concerned Jonathan, the 9-year-old boy Ruth had mentioned specifically. Her December entry noted his worsening cough and growing silence. In the doctor's professional opinion, extended cave dwelling would create perfect conditions for respiratory illness. Damp air, poor ventilation, constant cold. A child with pneumonia or similar affliction would deteriorate rapidly under such circumstances. The 3 graves likely held the youngest children, who may have succumbed to the extreme conditions in the caves. Their smaller bodies would have been most vulnerable to the harsh conditions. Ruth's final entries mentioned the twins' declining state and Jonathan's silence. The mathematics of survival suggested these would be the first casualties of Edmund's protective delusion. This left 4 people potentially alive when the graves were dug: Edmund, Ruth, and the 2 older children, Margaret, age 12, and presumably one other. But the evidence trail ended there. No bodies were found in the deeper chambers. No signs of recent habitation beyond January. The family, or what remained of it, had vanished as completely as if the earth itself had swallowed them. Brennan offered one final theory that made Cartwright's blood run cold. Men suffering from Edmund's particular form of delusion sometimes expanded their protective measures when faced with failure. If the children had begun dying despite his efforts to save them, Edmund might have concluded that even deeper concealment was necessary. The caves they'd explored might not be the end of the family's underground journey. Georgia's limestone formations were vast, interconnected through passages that remained unmapped. Some led to underground rivers. Others descended into chambers so deep that no lantern light had ever touched them. If Edmund had believed the watching had found his outer chambers, as Ruth's final entry suggested, he might have taken his remaining family into depths from which no return was possible. Sheriff Cartwright asked the question that haunted him. Could anyone survive in such depths? Brennan's answer was honest and brutal. For a time, perhaps. But without light, without adequate supplies, without hope of return, survival would be measured in days, not weeks. The caves would become not shelter, but tomb. Sheriff Cartwright organized a larger expedition in mid-April, recruiting experienced cave explorers from Tennessee who'd mapped similar limestone systems. 12 men entered the network this time, equipped with extensive rope, additional lanterns, and supplies for an extended search. Their mission was clear: find the deeper passages, locate any remaining evidence, and determine the final fate of the Patterson family. The Tennessee explorers immediately identified passages the first expedition had missed. Behind what appeared to be solid rock faces were narrow fissures, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. Edmund Patterson would have known about these openings. As a surveyor, Merritt confirmed that experienced woodsmen often explored caves thoroughly before settling nearby. Edmund had likely discovered the entire system long before moving his family underground. The expedition followed the narrowest passage for nearly 200 feet, the walls pressing close enough to restrict breathing. It opened suddenly into a chamber larger than any they'd previously documented. Here, the evidence of habitation was minimal but present. A single clay vessel, empty. Scraps of fabric that might have been clothing, and carved into the wall at waist height, a single word: deeper. The Tennessee explorers explained what this suggested. The Patterson family, or whoever survived to this point, had continued their descent beyond even this remote chamber. The question was whether they'd done so voluntarily, or whether Edmund had compelled them forward through force or manipulation. Either scenario was nightmarish. They discovered the next passage by following air currents. One of the explorers, a man named Hutchins, noticed cold air flowing from what appeared to be a solid corner. Investigation revealed another concealed opening, this one requiring them to crawl on hands and knees through 50 feet of tight tunnel. 2 men refused to continue, the enclosed space triggering primal fear. The remaining 10 pressed forward. The tunnel opened into a shaft that descended almost vertically. The explorers measured it at 43 feet deep, the bottom visible only when lanterns were lowered on ropes. The descent required careful management, each man belayed by those above. At the bottom, they found themselves in a cavern so vast their lantern light couldn't reach the far walls. The darkness here was absolute, pressing against their lights like something physical. They found the second cache in this deep chamber. Tin plates, the kind used for camping. Edmund's carpentry tools, abandoned in a careful arrangement against one wall. The family Bible that neighbors had mentioned, its pages swollen with moisture but still intact. And most significantly, they found Margaret's slate board again, or perhaps a second one, with a new message written in chalk. "Papa says the watching cannot reach us here. We are finally safe." The handwriting was Margaret's, identifiable by its childish precision. But the message's date, scratched into the stone beside it, read, January 12th. This was written weeks after Ruth's final journal entry. Margaret had survived that long. At least, had reached this impossible depth and still possessed enough faith or fear to record her father's assurances. The expedition searched for 3 more hours, mapping the chamber and examining every surface for additional clues. They found signs that at least 2 people had occupied this space for some duration. 2 sleeping areas, defined by the same stone borders seen in upper chambers. Food remnants suggesting perhaps a week of habitation. But no bodies, no indication of what happened next. One of the Tennessee explorers, examining the far reaches of the chamber, discovered something that changed their understanding completely. Another passage, this one sloping downward at a gentle angle, disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow their lantern light entirely. The passage walls showed marks consistent with recent traffic. Someone had moved through here, brushing against limestone that still showed fresh scars. Hutchins made the decision that likely saved lives. The expedition had been underground for 7 hours. Their lamp oil was running low, and the psychological strain of the depths was affecting even experienced explorers. They would mark this passage, document its location precisely, and return with better equipment and fresh supplies. Pushing forward now risked becoming trapped in a system they didn't understand. As they prepared to ascend, Sheriff Cartwright noticed something the others had missed. At the passage leading deeper, someone had arranged small stones into a pattern. Not random placement, but deliberate design. An arrow pointing downward into the depths, and beside it, carved with what must have been tremendous effort into the solid stone floor. 2 words that would haunt everyone who read them. Follow us. The expedition emerged from the caves after 9 hours underground, exhausted and deeply shaken. They'd found evidence that pushed the timeline of survival further than Dr. Brennan had thought possible. Margaret Patterson had been alive in mid-January, recording her father's continued delusions in the deepest chamber they could reach. And then she, along with whoever else survived, had gone even deeper. The question that paralyzed planning for any follow-up expedition was simple. Were they searching for survivors or recovering remains? And if Edmund Patterson had truly led his family into passages beyond what experienced explorers dared follow, would anyone ever know their final fate? The discovery came from an unexpected direction. In late January of 1822, nearly a year after Merritt first stumbled upon the graves, 2 hunters tracking deer along the Chattahoochee River found something that reignited the investigation. Snagged on branches near a shallow crossing, 15 miles downstream from the cave system, was a man's coat. Waterlogged and torn, but distinctive enough that when brought to the county office, Thomas Vaughn recognized it immediately from his records. The coat had belonged to Edmund Patterson. Vaughn had noted its description when cataloging the family's abandoned property. Dark wool with bone buttons, a tear in the left sleeve that Ruth had repaired with careful stitching. That repair work was still visible, the thread a slightly different color than the surrounding fabric. There was no question about ownership. Sheriff Cartwright examined the coat with forensic attention. The damage wasn't consistent with it simply being discarded or lost. The fabric showed signs of prolonged wear beyond what Edmund would have accumulated during his farming years. The elbows were worn through, the collar frayed to threads. This was a coat worn constantly, for months on end, in conditions that steadily destroyed it. More significantly, the inside pocket contained a folded paper, protected somewhat by the coat's layers, though badly water-damaged. The ink had run in most places, rendering the document nearly illegible. But enough words survived to identify it as a letter, begun but never completed. The salutation was clear. "Dear William," addressing Edmund's brother in Virginia. The preservation team in Savannah worked for 3 weeks to stabilize the paper and enhance what text remained readable. Their final transcript was fragmentary, missing perhaps 70% of the original content. But what survived was damning. Edmund had written this letter sometime after entering the caves, possibly in December or early January, based on references that could be partially deciphered. The clearest passage read, "You would say I am mad, brother, but I have seen what watches from the ridges. They wear the faces of men, but their eyes hold no soul. I have protected what matters most. The children are safe in the deep places where no light penetrates and no corruption can follow. Ruth doubts me still, but Margaret understands. She sees them too now." Another fragment from further in the letter. "When the watching began, I knew our home above was forfeit. Better the darkness we choose than the darkness they bring. The caves extend further than any map shows. There are chambers where the stone speaks, and passages that lead to places forgotten. We will go where they cannot follow." The final legible sentences were the most chilling. "If you receive this, know that I succeeded. The family is preserved. Tell no one where we have gone. The watching has ears everywhere." The letter had never been sent. Either Edmund had abandoned the idea, or circumstances prevented its delivery. The fact that his coat ended up in the river 15 miles from the caves suggested a journey, perhaps an attempt to reach civilization or find supplies. But Edmund himself had never emerged, only his coat, carried by water to where hunters would eventually find it. Sheriff Cartwright ordered searches along the riverbank in both directions from where the coat was discovered. They found nothing else. No body, no additional belongings, no sign of Edmund Patterson himself. The river could have carried him far downstream, or he might have never entered the water at all, having lost the coat through other means. Dr. Brennan, consulted again about the letter's contents, provided a grim analysis. Edmund's delusions had clearly progressed beyond simple paranoia. He was experiencing visual hallucinations, seeing watchers that existed only in his deteriorating mind. More concerning was his statement that Margaret sees them too now. This suggested either that he'd convinced his daughter to adopt his delusions, or that the extreme conditions underground had triggered similar psychological breaks in the child. The reference to deep places where no light penetrates aligned with the expedition's findings. Edmund had taken his family into the unmapped passages beyond what even experienced explorers dared traverse. His claim that the caves extended further than any map showed was technically accurate. The limestone systems beneath Georgia were vast and largely unexplored. What Brennan found most disturbing was Edmund's belief in success. The man had written that he succeeded in protecting his family, even as evidence suggested he'd led them to their doom. This complete disconnect from reality indicated profound mental deterioration. By the time he wrote this letter, Edmund Patterson was beyond reason, beyond help, beyond any possibility of recognizing the harm he'd caused. The coat's discovery raised as many questions as it answered. When had Edmund left the caves? Had he been alone, or had others been with him? If he'd intended to send the letter, why carry it to the river instead of toward settlements? Had he become lost, disoriented by months underground, unable to navigate familiar terrain? Most haunting was the mathematical certainty the coat provided. Edmund Patterson was dead. The river, the wilderness, or his own deteriorated condition had claimed him. Of the 6 family members who'd entered those caves in September of 1820, at least 4 were certainly gone. 3 in the graves near the entrance, Edmund somewhere in the wilderness or water. That left 2 people unaccounted for, Ruth Patterson and one of the children. And somewhere in the unexplored depths of Georgia's limestone darkness, there might still be answers about their fate. The Patterson case transformed the isolated Georgia community in ways that rippled outward for years. Parents who'd previously allowed their children to roam freely through the forests now kept them within sight of their homes. The caves became places of whispered warnings, locations that children were forbidden to approach. What had been natural shelters used by hunters and travelers became symbols of something far more sinister. Local newspapers couldn't resist the story. The Savannah Georgian published the first account in March of 1822, titling it, "The Mystery of the Cave Dwellers." The article spread to Charleston, then northward to Richmond and Philadelphia. By summer, newspapers as far as Boston were running variations of the tale, each adding their own embellishments and theories. The sensationalized coverage attracted the morbidly curious. Travelers began detouring through the county specifically to see the caves. Sheriff Cartwright was forced to post guards after vandals removed stones from the grave sites, seeking macabre souvenirs. The Patterson homestead, still abandoned, was broken into repeatedly until the county ordered it sealed completely. This media attention transformed the case from a local tragedy into something larger. It became one of the first missing persons cases in American history to receive widespread documentation and public interest. The combination of mysterious disappearance, underground isolation, and uncertain fate captured imaginations across the young nation. But the attention also brought theories, dozens of them, each attempting to explain what official investigations couldn't. Some claimed the family had been murdered by bandits, and the cave evidence planted to mislead authorities. Others suggested they'd successfully escaped and were living under assumed identities in frontier territories. A particularly persistent theory blamed indigenous tribes, despite complete lack of evidence, and Aita's testimony contradicting such claims. Religious interpretations emerged as well. Some preachers used the Patterson story as a cautionary tale about losing faith, claiming Edmund had been possessed by dark forces. Others framed it as judgment for unnamed sins. These explanations said more about those offering them than about what actually happened in those limestone depths. The community itself struggled with more immediate questions. How had no one noticed a family descending into such severe dysfunction? Edmund's paranoia must have shown warning signs before he moved his family underground. Had neighbors missed opportunities to intervene? The guilt spread quietly through the settlement, unspoken but deeply felt. Children who'd known the Patterson children dealt with their own trauma. Margaret had been 12, old enough to have friendships and social connections. Those who'd known her wrestled with memories of a normal girl, transformed by her father's delusions into someone who could write, "We are finally safe," while trapped in absolute darkness. The caves themselves developed a reputation that persisted for generations. Local folklore claimed they were cursed. that strange sounds could be heard echoing from the depths on certain nights. While most of these stories were superstition, they reflected genuine community trauma. The Patterson case had revealed how completely a family could vanish, how thoroughly the earth could swallow people who descended into its depths. By 1823, official investigation had effectively ceased. Sheriff Cartwright maintained the case files, adding occasional notes when new information surfaced, but no substantial leads emerged. The 3 graves remained, carefully maintained by the county. Edmund's coat was preserved in the records office. Ruth's journal sat in a locked drawer, but the family itself had passed from documented fact into something closer to legend, their true fate remaining as dark and impenetrable as the caves that claimed them. Decades passed before anyone attempted serious re-examination of the Patterson case. In 1867, a historian named Catherine Thornhill began researching Georgia's early settlement period and discovered the cave dweller files in county archives. What she found suggested possibilities that 1820s investigators had never considered. Thornhill approached the case with methods unavailable to Sheriff Cartwright. She cross-referenced Patterson family records with medical journals from the period, looking for patterns in Edmund's background that might explain his mental deterioration. What she discovered was telling. Edmund's father had died in an asylum in Virginia in 1813, institutionalized after claiming his neighbors were trying to poison his well. The family history suggested hereditary mental illness, a concept barely understood in Edmund's time. More significantly, Thornhill interviewed descendants of families who'd known the Pattersons. An elderly woman named Sarah Kimball, whose mother had been Ruth Patterson's closest friend, shared letters that had never been submitted to authorities. Ruth had written to Kimball's mother in July of 1820, months before the family disappeared. The letter described Edmund's increasing anxiety, his conviction that strangers were watching their property, his insistence on keeping weapons loaded at all times. The letter revealed Ruth's awareness of her husband's declining mental state. She'd written, "Edmund sees threats where none exist. I fear for the children's safety not from external dangers, but from his growing obsession with protection. He speaks of finding a place where we can hide from the watching eyes. I have tried reasoning with him, but he grows angry when questioned." This evidence suggested Ruth had recognized the danger, but felt powerless to act. In 1820, a wife had limited legal authority to commit a husband against his will, particularly in frontier territories. Social services didn't exist. Mental health treatment was primitive at best. Ruth had been trapped between her husband's delusions and her children's safety with no clear path to help. Thornhill's most disturbing discovery came from analyzing the cave system itself. Modern surveys conducted after the Civil War revealed that the deepest passages led to underground water sources. The limestone had been carved over millennia by rivers that still flowed through chambers no one had fully mapped. If Edmund had taken his family into those passages, following his delusion deeper and deeper into the earth, they might have encountered water too swift or deep to cross. The 3 graves, Thornhill concluded, likely held the youngest children who died first from illness or exposure. Edmund's coat in the river suggested he'd attempted to leave, perhaps seeking help after realizing the severity of his mistake, or perhaps already too disoriented to find his way back to civilization. That left Ruth and likely Margaret unaccounted for, their fate sealed in passages that even experienced modern explorers refused to fully investigate. Thornhill published her findings in 1871, providing context that transformed the Patterson case from mysterious disappearance into documented tragedy of untreated mental illness. Her work established it as a historical example of how frontier isolation, combined with psychological disorders and lack of medical intervention, could destroy entire families. But her research couldn't answer the question that continued to haunt anyone who studied the case. What happened in those final hours? Did Ruth and Margaret survive Edmund's departure, only to find themselves trapped in darkness without his knowledge of the passages? Did they attempt to follow him and become lost in the labyrinth? Or did something else entirely claim them in those unmapped depths where light never reached and time held no meaning? The Patterson case remains Georgia's oldest unsolved disappearance, a mystery that refuses to release its grip on those who encounter it. The cave system, now partially collapsed from natural erosion and deliberate sealing by authorities concerned about safety, still exists. Occasional explorers request permits to investigate, drawn by the possibility of finding answers that have eluded searchers for 2 centuries. Modern forensic techniques have been applied to Ruth's journal fragments. Analysis of the ink and paper confirms the dating. Linguistic experts have studied her word choices, noting the progression from hopeful pleading to desperate resignation. Every examination reinforces the same terrible narrative: a woman watching helplessly as her husband's delusions condemned their family to darkness and death. The 3 graves near the cave entrance were exhumed in 1973 during a comprehensive archaeological survey. The remains confirmed what investigators had suspected: 3 children, ages consistent with Jonathan, Samuel, and Rebecca Patterson. Cause of death couldn't be determined with certainty after so many years, but evidence suggested prolonged malnutrition and exposure. They had died slowly in those caves, their small bodies unable to sustain life under conditions that would challenge even healthy adults. Ruth Patterson's final resting place has never been found. Neither has Margaret's. The deepest chambers explored in modern times show no additional human remains, no evidence beyond what 18th century expeditions documented. It's possible their bodies were carried away by underground water systems, deposited in chambers too remote or dangerous to access. It's equally possible they lie in passages that have since collapsed, sealed forever beneath tons of limestone. What makes the Patterson case historically significant isn't just its age or mystery. It represents one of the first documented instances of systematic investigation into a missing persons case in American history. Sheriff Cartwright's meticulous record-keeping, Dr. Brennan's psychological analysis, the organized expeditions and evidence preservation, all these established precedents that would inform future investigations. The case also illuminates the devastating intersection of mental illness and frontier isolation. In a more populated area with better medical resources, Edmund Patterson might have received treatment. His family might have had access to intervention. But in 1820 Georgia, mental deterioration was often mistaken for eccentricity until tragedy made the distinction clear. Perhaps most haunting is what the evidence reveals about awareness and helplessness. Ruth knew her husband was descending into madness. She documented it, wrote about it, recognized the danger. Margaret understood enough to feel resignation rather than hope. Yet neither could escape the cage Edmund's delusions had built around them. They went into darkness, knowing it was wrong, compelled by circumstance and the limited options available to frontier women and children. The limestone caves remain, scarred with the desperate tallies of a family counting days in perpetual night. Ruth's journal sits in a climate-controlled archive, its surviving pages testament to maternal desperation. Edmund's water-damaged letter rests beside it, evidence of delusion so complete it convinced a man he'd succeeded while actually destroying everything he claimed to protect. The Patterson family vanished in September of 1820. 6 people entered those caves seeking protection from threats that existed only in one man's deteriorating mind. 3 small bodies were eventually recovered and properly buried. One man's coat was found miles away, carried by river current to temporary light before sinking back into mystery. 2 people were never found at all, their final moments known only to the darkness that claimed them. This case is often described as one of the earliest missing persons mysteries associated with the region, though its full accuracy remains debated. Not because evidence doesn't exist, but because the final chapter of the Patterson family's story is written in places human eyes cannot reach, in depths where even the most determined investigation must eventually stop and simply wonder what happened when the last lantern finally went dark. If this story has disturbed you, if it's made you think about the fragility of sanity and the horror of helplessness, then share it. This channel exists to preserve these forgotten tragedies, to ensure that families like the Pattersons aren't lost completely to time. Subscribe to see more stories that history tried to bury. Like this video. If you believe these mysteries deserve answers, even when answers remain forever out of reach.